preacher? Are you compelling people? You say, I don't feel like telling people. Again, maybe you're not saved. Maybe you don't know the same God that I know. God has been too good to me, Brother Tim, in order for me not to tell people about how good God's been to me. I love it to get around you, Brother Tim. I'm using it because it's all the time. God's good. God's wonderful. God's been so good to me this week. Hallelujah. Let's go eat. I love that. I got to stop. The going out again servant has a place to go. He has a passion for God. And he has a purpose to gain. My purpose is Jesus. My purpose is Jesus. What's your purpose this morning? Is it Jesus? Is it Jesus? Boy, many times throughout these scriptures, Jesus told the disciples even this: if you don't hate your father and mother, you can't be my disciple. Oh, God's using the word hate. No, He's not telling you to literally hate them, but your love for God ought to be so great that He's the first thing you think about. I wouldn't dare miss church to go visit family. Wicked out of hell, that is. But you've had some young person in your home tell you, we don't want to go to church. Let's go have fun. Or I don't feel like going to church. My friend, you have a purpose. You have a compelling purpose to gain. It's God's house. It's that His house may be filled. That's a purpose. God, who in the world would not want somebody to know Jesus? And the best place to get to know Jesus is at the house of God. And one day, His heaven will be filled if we'll do our job. Are you a servant? Are we going out again and again and again? Are we doing what God wants us to do? You say, but preacher, I'm not very outgoing and outspoken. I'm a shy person. I don't feel like that. I'm like you. I can't talk to people. I don't know what I can do. A number of years ago in a Baptist church in the Crystal Palace in southern London, the Sunday morning service was closing. And a stranger stood up in the back and raised his hand and said, "Excuse me, Pastor, can I share a little testimony?" The pastor looked at his watch and said, "You got 3 minutes." The man proceeded. He said, "I just moved into this area. I used to live in another part of London. I came from Sydney in Australia. And just a few months back, I was visiting some relatives and I was walking down George Street." You know, George Street is in Sydney. And it runs from the business hub out to the rocks of the colonial area. And he said, a strange little white-haired man stepped out of a shop doorway. And he put a pamphlet in my hand and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you die tonight, are you going to heaven?" he said. I was astounded by those words. Nobody had ever told me that. I thanked him curiously. And all the way on British Airlines back to Heathrow, this puzzled me. I called a friend who lived in this new area where I'm living now. And thank God he was a Christian. He led me to Christ, and I'm a Christian, and I want a fellowship here. Baptists love testimonies like that. Everyone applauded and welcomed him into the fellowship of the church. That Baptist pastor's name was Francis Dixon. He flew to a place in Australia the next week. And 10 days later, in the middle of a 3-day service in a Baptist church in Australia, a woman came to him for counseling. And he wanted to establish where she stood with Christ. She said, "I used to live in Sydney. And just a couple of months back, I was visiting friends in Sydney, doing some last-minute shopping down George Street. A strange little white-haired man, elderly, stepped out from a shop doorway, and he offered me a pamphlet and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you saved? If you die tonight, are you sure you're going to heaven?" She said, "I was disturbed by those words. When I got back to the city in Australia, I knew this Baptist church. It was on the next block from me. I sought out the pastor, and he led me to Christ. So, sir, I'm telling you that I'm a Christian." Now Francis Dixon, this London pastor, was very puzzled. Twice within a fortnight, he had heard the same testimony. He then flew to preach at the Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in Perth. And when his teaching services was over, the senior pastor took him for a meal. Mr. Dixon said, "Mate, how did you get saved?" He said, "I grew up in this church from the age 15 through the Boys Brigade and never made a commitment to Jesus. Just hopped on the bandwagon like everybody else, and because of my business ability, grew up to a place of influence. I was on a business outing in Sydney just 3 years ago, and an obnoxious, spiteful little man stepped out a shop doorway, offered me a religious pamphlet. He said it was cheap junk. He accosted me with a question. He said, "Excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you die tonight, you're going to heaven?" He said, I tried to tell him I was a Baptist elder. He wouldn't listen to me. He said, I was. Seething with anger all the way home, back to Perth, he said, I told my pastor then, thinking he would sympathize with me, that this little man stepped down and gave me a pamphlet and asked me if I was going to heaven. He said, lo and behold, he said, my pastor agreed with the little man. He had been disturbed for years knowing that I didn't have a relationship with Jesus, and he was right. And my pastor led me to Jesus just 3 years ago, and now I'm pastoring. Now this same pastor, Francis Dixon, flew back to the UK and was speaking in Keswick, the convention in the Lake District. And he threw in these 3 testimonies at the close of his teaching session. This pastor, 4 elderly pastors came up and said, we got saved between the ages of 25 and 35 years ago, respectively, through a little man on George Street giving us a tract and asking us a question. Then the same pastor flew the following week, went to a similar Keswick convention in the Caribbean to missionaries. And he shared these testimonies. He shared the testimonies of these people getting saved by some white-haired man on George Street, giving them a tract. And at the close of his teaching sessions, after he had given the testimonies of these other people getting saved, 3 missionaries came up and said, we got saved between the ages of 15 and 25 years ago, respectively, through that little man's testimony, and asking us the same question on George Street in Sydney. This same preacher came back to London. He stopped outside Atlanta, Georgia, to speak at the Naval Chaplains Convention. And when his 3 days of reviving these Navy chaplains up, after preaching to them, over 1,000 of them, and soul winning, the chaplains general took him out for a meal. And the preacher, Mr. Francis Dixon, asked the chaplain, how did you become a Christian? He said, well, it was miraculous. I was ranting on a United States battleship, and I lived a reprobate life. We were doing exercises in the South Pacific, and we docked in Sydney for replenishments. We hit the King's Cross with a vengeance. I got blind drunk. I got on the wrong bus and got off on George Street. As I got off the bus, I thought it was a ghost. And this elderly white-haired man jumped in front of me, pushed a pamphlet in my hands and said, sailor, are you saved? If you die tonight, are you going to heaven? He said the fear of God hit me immediately. I was shocked sober and ran back to the battleship. Sought out the chaplain. The chaplain led me to Christ, and I soon began to prepare for the ministry under his guidance. And here I am in charge of over 1,000 chaplains. And we're bent on soul winning today. That London preacher, 6 months later, flew to a convention of over 5,000 Indian missionaries in a remote corner of India. And at the end, the Indian missionary in charge, a humble little man, took him home to his humble little house for a simple meal. And Mr. Dixon said, how did you, as a Hindu, come to Christ? He said, I was in a very privileged position. I worked for the Indian diplomatic mission. I traveled the world, and I'm so glad for the forgiveness of Christ. His blood covering my sin, because I'd be very, very embarrassed if people found out what I got into, he said. On a bout of diplomatic service, one day it took me to Sydney, and I was doing some last-minute shopping, laden with parcels of toys and clothing for my children, walking down George Street. A curious little white-haired man stepped out in front of me. He offered me a pamphlet and said, excuse me, sir, are you saved? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven? He said, I thanked him very much, but this disturbed me. I got back to my town. I sought out the Hindu priest. The Hindu priest couldn't help me, but he gave me some advice. He said, just to satisfy your curious Hindu mind, he said, with nothing else, he said, go talk to the missionary up the street. And he said, I took the Hindu leader's advice. He said, because of that day, the missionary led me to Christ. I quit Hinduism immediately and then began to study for the ministry. I left the diplomatic service, and here I am, by God's grace, in charge of all these missionaries. And we're winning hundreds of thousands of people to Christ. Well, 8 months later, the Crystal Palace pastor was ministering in Sydney, in Jimere, the southern suburb of Sydney. And he said to the Baptist minister, do you know a little elderly man who witnesses and hands out tracts on George Street? And the preacher said, I do. His name is Frank Jenner. But I don't think he does it anymore. He's too frail and elderly. The preacher, Mr. Dixon, said, I want to meet him. I would have wanted to meet him too. He said 2 nights later, they went around to his little apartment, knocked on the door, and this tiny, frail little man opened the door. He set them down and made them some tea. He was so frail that he was slopping tea into the saucer as he shook. And as he sat with them, this London preacher told him of all these accounts over the previous 3 years. This little man, Mr. Frank Jenner, sat there with tears running down his cheeks. Mr. Frank Jenner said, preacher, my story goes like this. He said, I was ranting on an Australian warship. He said, I lived a reprobate life. And in a crisis, I really hit the wall. And one of my colleagues, turn that off. He said, and I lived a reprobate life, and in a crisis, I really hit the wall. And one of my colleagues, whom I gave literal hell, was there to help me. He led me to Jesus, and the change in my life was night and day. In 24 hours, I was so grateful to God. I promised to God that I would share Jesus in a simple witness with at least 10 people a day. As God gave me strength, sometimes I was ill. I couldn't do it. But I made it up at other times. I was paranoid about it. I have done this for over 40 years. And in my retirement, the best place was on George Street. There were hundreds of people. I got lots of rejections. But a lot of people curiously took the tracts. Get this, folks. Listen to the end of this. And he said, in 40 years, I've never heard of one single person coming to Jesus until today. Pastor Dixon, Francis Dixon, calculated the best he could the amount of people that Mr. Jenner had reached with those tracts. He calculated that 146,100 people came to Christ. because he was willing to step out. He said, Lord, you've been so good to me that I'll tell 10 people a day. I'll just give them a tract. That's all I know to do. And all I'll do is just give them a tract, and I'll say to them, if you died today, would you go to heaven? Do you know Jesus? And he would talk to him and give them that tract. And because of that, thousands and thousands of people got saved. It wasn't just one time. He would go again. Don't let this story just be an emotional story for you. Let it sink in. He would go again. And he thought, many days, I don't even know if this is working. And 40 years later was the first time that he heard about anybody coming to Jesus because he gave out one tract. Have you quit on God? It might be the next tract you give out, Brother Blake. Might be a Hindu that goes home and is curious and asks his Hindu